So remember last time we talked about the whole issue of atheism, and we talked about agnosticism, and we talked about how we considered agnosticism to be self-refuting, because in order to declare that the spiritual or the realm of God is unknowable, you have to know something about that realm to declare it unknowable. And so those are some of the things that we just want to be able to point out. We're not necessarily talking about spending the course of your life studying all these different worldviews, but if there's some pretty basic self-contradictions in those sort of things, I think it's worthwhile to be able to point those things out. So I did want to mention deism. So kind of the road that we're going here is we're going to talk about deism in particular, and then we'll talk about Hinduism and Buddhism, particularly getting into the Eastern religions. The section on pantheism, I think, will intersect somewhat with Hinduism because there's some pantheistic elements in regard to Hinduism, so we'll be looking at that as well. So now when we come to deism, how many of you had me for historical theology 2? Okay, so a fair amount of you, not all of you, but some of you had. We spent a fair amount talking about deism, and I really thought the Olson book, for all of its strengths and faults, probably one of the strongest aspects of the Olson book on the story of Christian theology was his discussion of deism. As a movement, we usually don't think of deism as a big deal these days. And we usually, when you track it historically, you think of it as something that really, rose like a Roman candle, in the 1600s and 1700s, and at the time of the American Revolution, and then, because of some of the things that David Hume said, it kind of faltered and that sort of thing. But deism is one of these things that it has carried over. You may not necessarily find deism as a specific movement today, but you find people with deistic ideas. And even like, Antony Flew, who I told you about before, who was a leading promoter of atheism, he looked at evidence for God's existence and became a believer in a God, not the God of Christianity, but became, I think he even used the word deist. And so I guess whenever you see anybody kind of have a view where they're saying, yeah, I believe there's something out there that created everything, but I'm not too concerned about it, and I don't think whoever created the world's that concerned, and I don't really get into the supernatural and the miracles and all that kind of thing. That's pretty close to deism. So I do think it is worthwhile to examine just even for a little bit here. I would even say, and particularly I think this is reinforced by what Olson in the Story of Christian Theology talked about, is deism in a sense is almost kind of like the view of religion of the American government, or particularly like I really see it a lot when you're dealing with a political year. So I see a lot of deism in every 4 years, in particular when you're you see a presidential election, and what do I mean by that? Well, I think you see I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I haven't really defined deism yet, but I think whenever you see a general religiosity and even a general Christianity, but a talk of religion where you better not cross the line and start talking about specifics of Jesus, I think you're kind of dealing a little bit with a deistic mindset. As a matter of fact, I think Roger Olson's pretty right when he says that, in a sense, deism is pretty much kind of the view of the general, political realm and governmental realm. And so, if you notice, when it comes to, if you look at all the elections, I would even say up till this year, there is a minimal amount of religiosity that needs to be there for a candidate. Even as we continually become more secularly progressive, I still don't know if the country's ready yet to embrace an atheist for president, and probably not even a Muslim for president. And so there appears to be at least some sort of bar where the person better at least be somewhat of a nominal Christian. And so that's even kind of popped up a little bit with whole discussions of whether Barack Obama is a Christian, and there's some rumors that he was a Muslim and all that kind of thing. Those sorts of things come into play. And so in general, you saw it happen with Jimmy Carter when he was running in 76 and in 80. He was, it was his religiosity was important. And you just see it with the presidents that usually there's some sort of adherence to Christianity in some sense. And if that's not there, then that would probably hurt that person. But on the other side too, if there were to be a specific talk about what we would consider to be evangelical biblical beliefs, then that crosses a line that's too far. And so I think you even see that a little bit even today with Sarah Palin. I mean, she's an evangelical, and yet you can see that she's had to probably kind of moderate some of her views and kind of use cautious language because those views might be considered too strong for what most people in America can stomach at this time. So anyway, I do think as we look at deism that it does have some relevance to today, because it is a very generic understanding of God, and I would see deism as inherently flawed and not an acceptable approach to religion or to God or to Christianity. So if you look at Geisler, he talks about deism on page 51. I'm going to point you to page 152. I guess what we'll do is let's just explain a little bit about what deism is and then talk about why there's some problems with it. He really in a nutshell what you're going to get with deism is I'd say there's basically two things we can focus on. I think really at the heart what you see with deism is an elevation of human reason over revelation. An elevation of human reason over revelation. And in that sense, to me, deism really became the religion of the Enlightenment. Because with the Enlightenment, you had a whole world view there, of Europe, and North America, which would, say that, we're going to use our human reason to determine what we're going to believe or not. So, reason over revelation. And then the thing that most people think of when they think of deism would be the absentee landlord concept, which is the view that, yes, there is some sort of creator, small g, some sort of God, small g, that got everything going and started and created the world. But this being is not really involved with the world. This is not somebody that we have a relationship with. And there's not too much concern about the afterlife and those sorts of things. So yes, there is some sort of creator, but we're not going to buy the whole package about Jesus being God and the Trinity and the necessity of salvation and all those sorts of things. What we will go for, if you're a deist, is a general morality, which is we have basic beliefs in right and wrong and good and bad and those sorts of things, but don't necessarily ask us to give a basis for why we believe in good and bad. We just kind of generally believe that. So deism is a broad umbrella. It can encompass a lot of different groups. As a matter of fact, there was really hope, even in the 1700s, that deism might become like a universal religion. It's very generic, and hopefully can encompass everybody. But clearly that did not work out. Many people too would see deism as kind of a forerunner to Protestant liberalism that we see today, because again, it's going to deny essential Christian doctrine while still, quote, holding on to some sort of belief in God. So I'm not so much interested in giving you the big history of deism. I mean, Geisler on page 152 and following points out a bunch of guys who were significant. At the bottom of page 152, he mentions Herbert of Cherbury, who lived in the early part of the 17th century. One of the things that I think you'll see with these guys that he points out is that there appears to be an acceptance that there had to be some sort of creator, but there's also at the same time a denial of the supernatural or a skepticism towards the supernatural. So as people progress with their Enlightenment worldview, the whole concept of miracles and biblical miracles and all those sorts of things don't seem to hold water or be reasonable to the human mind. And so you got various individuals, you have Hume and Kant and other people like that who really have a hostility towards the concept of the supernatural. So make sure you get at this point, because we're going to talk about this in the evaluation here, is that usually with deism, there's an understanding that there was some sort of beginning to the universe, some sort of creation, but at the same time, there's also a denial of the reality of the supernatural and miracles. taking place. So if you come to, let's look at page 166, the central tenets of deism. He mentions here the foregoing survey of deism amply indicates the diversity within the deistic movement. There are few, if any, hard and fast lines of demarcation. So look at the next paragraph now. For systematic purposes, we will have to ignore the historical shades and overlappings with deism and skepticism and describe a deistic position that is mutually exclusive to both supernatural theism and to pure naturalism. In this regard, a deist will be defined as one who believes there is a God beyond the world who created the world, but that the world runs by natural law without supernatural interference. So that's kind of the definition he's laying out. I would say all that's true, and again, I would emphasize, as Olson did in his book, that it's also to an elevation of the human reason above revelation. So some sort of created being. As a matter of fact, if I were tinkering with that sentence, I wouldn't even put God in capital letters. We're just talking about some sort of general being. Now, I will qualify that by saying that when you look at some of the earlier deists, they actually were pretty close to Christianity on some points. But if we're speaking in general, this is more of a general creator. If you look at point number 1, still there on page 166, the first premise of a deistic worldview is that there is a God who created the universe. In contrast to dualism, which holds that matter is eternal, the deists believe that the material universe was created by God. Now, that's important to keep in mind when we get to our evaluation, okay? So God is eternal, and in contrast to pure naturalism or atheism, a deist believes that it is necessary to posit a God as the author and architect of the universe. There is a first cause beyond the natural world who originated all of the natural processes. Likewise, in distinction from pantheism, a deist believes that God is not identical with the real world. All is not God, and God is not all for a deist. Point number 2, the second major premise of deism is anti-supernaturalism. Miracles do not occur. Some argue that a perfect God cannot make an imperfect universe, which would demand miraculous interruption and repair. And so he mentions in the last sentence of that paragraph, anti-supernaturalism is a distinguishing characteristic of deism. So that's, the Jefferson Bible, the take out all the miracles sort of thing. Keep the ethics. That sounds pretty good, but let's take out the miracles. Number 3 on page 167, the third major tenet of deism is a Unitarian concept of God that involves a denial of the orthodox doctrines of the Trinity and the deity of Christ, because the doctrines of the Trinity and the deity of Christ don't meet allegedly the bar of human reason. And so, that also gets tossed out. So one thing I didn't mention as well is that you do see deism, in a sense, melding itself into Unitarianism. So if you're looking for deism and its impacts today, I think you would see it with the Unitarian movement, with its denial of the Trinity and the deity of Christ. So clearly a forerunner of liberalism. Now let's go to the critique of the deistic worldview. And I think Geisler makes some pretty keen points here. Again, I know he's a classical apologist, but I think some of the arguments he makes here could actually be argued from a transcendental perspective and show the inconsistency within the deistic worldview. If you look at his point number 1 there, and this is on 169 under the negative critique of the deistic worldview, he points out that first of all, the deist understanding of God is incompatible with their stand against miracles. Now listen to this. Since God performed the miracle of creation ex nihilo, or from or out of nothing, it follows from the very nature and power of this kind that this kind of God, let me start over. It follows from the very nature and power of this kind of God that other lesser miracles are possible. Walking on water is little problem for a God who created water to begin with. To make a human being through a female ovum, virgin birth, is not difficult for a God who made a world from nothing. And multiplying loaves is surely not a greater feat than creating matter in the first place. In short, it is self-defeating to admit the miracle of creation and to deny that other miracles are possible. So I think that's a pretty keen observation there, because they're granting that there's some kind of creation out of nothing. And yet when it comes to, miracles, all of a sudden, those are supposed to be unreasonable to the human mind. So it seems to me, I think he's pointing out a consistency here, is the deists are granting the biggest miracle of all, which is creation out of nothing, but yet when it comes to walking on water and virgin birth, we're supposed to say, well, that's not reasonable. That's just, something that we just can't accept. And so, yeah, John.
Would deists, I know that most of them were before Darwin, would they integrate some sort of evolutionary idea, or would it be close to our 7-day creation idea that they would hold to, or would they even get into that detail?
Yeah, it probably would be I would say these early guys, it would be more of the literal creation. Like, clearly, as you get on post-Darwin, as deism molds itself in with other movements and becomes somewhat eclectic, it would be Darwinian. But early on, I think it would be that you would see that. Mm-hmm. So everybody get that point? I mean, they're granting that there's this big creation out of nothing, but then they're skeptical about all the other miracles. But if you're going to accept creation, why can't you accept other miracles? Number 2, he states at the bottom, page 169, second, the deistic concept of God is built on an invalid mechanistic model rather than on a personal model. God is not a mere master machine maker. And so he's pointing out here the personal nature of God, which I think is true, because again, if you get into any kind of ethics or morals, you have to have some sort of a personal God. Let's see, number 3 on page 170. A God concerned enough to create men in the beginning should be concerned enough to intervene on their behalf, men who have fallen into grave difficulties. So again, if you're going to accept that God created everything, which includes the human race, then why would it be so incredible that he would continue, to desire to have a relationship with people? Because pretty much the absentee landlord view that you often hear about deism is that, the watchmaker who makes the watch and then never sees the watch again and doesn't care. But clearly, if you have a caring enough as far as the intricacies of making the human race, it wouldn't be so absurd to think that he would care enough to deal with them after that. Number 4, the deistic arguments intended to eliminate the basis for belief in a supernatural revelation apply equally as well to elimination of the deistic belief in creation. This is almost kind of like number 1 in my opinion. The deist has no more right to believe that God created the world from nothing than the supernaturalist does that God has performed miracles. And then number 5, he just believes that their attack on the trustworthiness of the Bible is not correct. And so, anyway, I would say probably the key critique there, at least on the issue of miracles, would be found in number 1. So I would see deism as being an unacceptable worldview. Any thoughts on any of that? What Geisler wrote? Anything about deism? Okay, all right, let's move on now let's shift now to the Eastern religions. So we've talked about, we've talked about atheism, we've talked about agnosticism, we've talked about deism. So we're going through all the isms. So now we're going to talk about the Eastern religions with Hinduism and Buddhism. Okay, so let's talk about Hinduism now. Okay, all right, so page 101. Well, first of all, before we get into that, I mean, just curious, how many of you guys would say that you've had some sort of contact with, not necessarily just people of other religions, but how about like Eastern religions? If it comes to, okay, it's almost everybody here. And I think since the since the 60s and the 70s with more immigration and that sort of thing, and people from non-Western societies, you definitely see a lot more contact with people from a Hindu or a Buddhist worldview. So let's go ahead and talk about that. I mean, usually when we're talking about the Eastern religions, so if we're talking about the Eastern religions, there ends up being some big ones that we focus on here. I think in a nutshell, I mean, just to make things easier, oftentimes when we think of the world religions, we think of, wow, all these different religions, and of course there are. As a matter of fact, I think probably the best estimate about how many actual religions there are in the world would probably be around 4,200. When it comes down to it, there ends up being about 10 or 12 that are usually considered on the major religions list. I think there's a sense in which you can lump a lot of the world under the category of the of Eastern religions. As a matter of fact, you clearly would have Hinduism, you would have Buddhism, there's also Jainism, and Sikhism. And all of these religions have one country as their origin of birth. So we know what that would be? Yeah, India. These would all be religions of India. So this is what we're going to focus on mostly here. And this ends up being a pretty big slice of the pie. So you have Hinduism, Buddhism, which are, very large religions, well represented. Jainism and Sikhism have a lot less people who would be adherents of them, but there's still significant numbers over, in India and close regions. You could also say too that you'll get into, the religions of China and Japan. That's not so much what we're looking at right away here, because you get into Taoism, Confucianism, Shinto for Japan. These two with China. And you get offshoots too. You have the traditional Chinese religion or traditional Chinese beliefs. When you look at Taoism and Confucianism, those both come around like the 6th century BC. So there's actually a lot of religious beliefs that go forth that are taking place in China before Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, even because there was definitely something in the water in the 6th century BC. Because Buddhism begins in the 6th century BC, Jainism begins in the 6th century BC, Taoism and Confucianism begin in the 6th century BC. And then if you want to expand things out a little bit, usually the beginning of Greek philosophy began in the 6th century BC with the pre-Socratic philosophers. So there's something going on at that particular time period. Hinduism is going to be a religion of India that, as they say, goes back to the mist of antiquity. Some will want to date it around 3000 BC. It's probably more accurate to say that it starts to take more of the form that we're used to around 1500 BC. Shinto will be an ancient religion of Japan. But these other religions have starting points. Actually, Sikhism will actually begin around the time of the Protestant Reformation in India. But for our purposes, what we're going to address initially will probably fall in this category here of the Eastern religions, and in particular the religions of India. So it may surprise you to know that a lot of the evaluation that you would give of Hinduism would also apply to Buddhism. They're not exactly the same, of course, but Buddhism really stems from a Hindu worldview. So I guess what I'm getting at is there is a sense in which if you get the basic ideas of the religions of India, you're dealing with a pretty big segment, of the world or of the religious population in the world. So I think there is a sense in which you can go after Eastern religions on some basic points that will actually apply to a lot of different religions. Okay, so Hinduism, as I mentioned on page 101, is a religious tradition of Indian origin comprising the beliefs and practices of the Hindus. I'm not going to read everything here. If you look at point D, the Hindus prefer the term the Sanatana Dharma, which means eternal religion. It exists primarily in India, although it's spread to other areas. There's approximately, this number here would be a few years old, so it's probably more than that, but there's roughly around 900 million Hindus today. The total number of Hindus in India is hard to compute since there are about 300 million untouchables. These untouchables are counted as part of the Hindu social structure, but they're not allowed to participate fully in Hindu religion. So Hinduism traditionally has had a caste system with a very strict hierarchy within the culture. And so, certain groups like the untouchables are not supposed to mix with some of the other groups. About 20 million Hindus live outside of India. About 1.5 million Hindus live in the United States. This accounts for maybe 0.5% of the U.S. population. It's the third largest religious community in the world. Now let's jump to point L on page 102. Hinduism has no central doctrinal system. It is very vast with many holy books and sometimes appears to teach contradicting things. It is also a very eclectic religion in that it easily incorporates elements of their religions and philosophies. And within Hinduism, there are various schools of thought. So Hinduism by nature is very broad, very eclectic. I think there's some basic things that are good for Christians to understand about it. I think there's going to be a sense in which, I think two things need to be kept in mind. First of all, I don't want to give the impression that Hindus as people are so different from what we are that there's no point of contact, because that's not true, because they're made in the image of God like we are. So sometimes when I read, even Christian books talking about how to deal with Hinduism, sometimes it almost paints them like they're from outer space, and that there's, but the thing is no matter what religion a person is, they're made in the image of God, and they still have to live in His world, and they still have to operate according to a lot of the ways that He set things up. That's how come I believe that you'll find in every religion you'll have a basic ethical system that, of course, you may have some things here and there that aren't right or whatever, but they still have the law written on their heart. Of course, they're truth suppressors and depraved and all that, but they still have to operate according to a general standard of morality, and so we have to keep that in mind. So we balance that also with the fact that there's no doubt that the Eastern worldview is quite different than the Western worldview, and oftentimes the biblical worldview. I'm not equating the two. I'm not equating Western worldview with biblical worldview, because clearly there's some points of difference. But I think it's helpful if we have some, a basic understanding of some of the of their worldview assumptions, which will be able to help us more strategically present the Christian worldview and go after the antithesis. Like as Van Til would talk about, going after the antithesis, making the distinction, showing what the Bible has to say. And of course, as you positively present the gospel, you'll also be confronting false beliefs that they would hold. If you look at Hinduism in history, as I mentioned before, certain beliefs go back to 3000. You could probably say around 1500 BC it started to take the form that we're most familiar with. Let's see here. Let's jump to worldview summary. You can read the rest of that stuff if you want for more historical information. But let's go ahead and talk about their worldview summary. Now remember, last week, 2 or 3 classes ago, we talked about a summary of the Christian worldview, and I pointed out that there's about 10 aspects of a worldview. And so we talked about what the Christian worldview is. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the Hindu worldview, and in doing so, be able to see the contrast between Christianity and Hinduism. When it comes to the worldview summary of Hinduism, we're going to want to talk about the view of the absolute. Now, again, if you're a Christian, your understanding of the absolute, and rightfully so, is that it's the God of the Bible. It's the triune God of the Bible who is personal, who's also immutable, all-powerful, all-knowing, all the sorts of things that we that's been revealed to us in Scripture that we know about God. The absolute of Hinduism is Brahman. Brahman is the ultimate reality, the highest deity. Brahman is the unchanging reality composed of pure being and consciousness. As a matter of fact, Brahman is viewed to be the ground of all gods. And so, I think what we're getting at here is there is a concept of the absolute, which is the ultimate reality, and this ultimate reality is going to be the basis for all the other gods of Hinduism. One thing about Hinduism is it's hard to put it into a box as far as their specific theistic view. Like if I were to say to you, is Hinduism monotheistic or polytheistic or pantheistic? Most people, I think, when probably the average Westerner, when they think of Hinduism, they'll say, well, polytheistic. And I think there's a sense in which they'd be right, because, I mean, there's tens of thousands of gods within Hinduism. There ends up being, supposedly 3 manifestations of Brahman that get the most attention, but literally there's thousands of gods within Hinduism. So there's a sense in which you could declare polytheism, many gods, and you'd be right. But there's also a sense, too, in which you could claim that Hinduism is monotheism, if you're referring specifically to Brahman, and because Brahman really ends up being the ground or the basis for all the other gods of Hinduism. So supposedly all the tens of thousands of gods within Hinduism are really reflections of the one Brahman. And so one analogy that I saw, I don't know how great it is, but if you remember, if you see footage from the 70s, the disco balls, where you have the disco ball turning, but then all the lights that are on, you see all these hundreds of thousands of reflections on the wall. Some would say that Brahman is like the disco ball, and all the other reflections are the Hindu gods. So you have that one which manifests itself in the many. So now, with this Brahman, in essence, what ends up being is that Brahman is largely and mostly impersonal. And again, this is going to be a major problem for Hinduism, is how do you get any kind of ethical standards against an impersonal entity? So it's largely impersonal, but these manifestations can be personal. And so you have Vishnu and Shiva and Brahma. And then you can even have manifestations of those, and that's where you get into like Krishna. And then you'll actually have these avatars who actually become humans. So you have like a Krishna who comes to earth and helps. And so it is interesting within Hinduism that you have this impersonal absolute, but these manifestations of the impersonal are personal, which again runs into a logical inconsistency there of how you're getting personal from impersonal. Hindus, point 4, will debate whether Brahman has distinguishable personal attributes. It is clear that Brahman is mainly a non-personal entity. When understood as a god among gods, Brahman can be said to be personal. In this mode, Brahman is Saguna Brahman. But in the role of ultimate reality, Brahman is Nirguna Brahman, impersonal, without attributes. Which again, we're going to hammer this home as being a major problem. Brahman is supposed to transcend all limiting attributes. So listen to Shankara, an 8th century Hindu scholar who wrote, Ishvara or Brahman, forgive these 3 sins of mine, that although you are everywhere, I have gone on a pilgrimage. Although you are beyond the mind, I have tried to think of you. And although you are indescribable, I offer this hymn in praise of you. And so it's almost, in a sense, it's almost like there's this internal contradiction that even in the pursuit of Brahman, there's an inconsistency going on. Because any attempt to try to describe Brahman is inconsistent because it's indescribable. Any attempt to try to have any kind of relationship with it is inconsistent because it's impersonal. On page 104, point number 6, Brahman takes the form of 3 main Hindu deities who correspond to the 3 stages of the cycle of the universe. So you have the so this is how it looks. You have Brahman up here, which is impersonal, and the ground of all being. Okay, and then you actually have manifestations of that with Brahma, and then Vishnu, and then Shiva. So when you see, you'll actually see actual statues and idols of these gods, like the bull that you often see in some of the depictions. And then you can actually have manifestations of these gods as well. So that's where you start to get the breakdown into the multiple. Supposedly Brahma is the creative spirit, Vishnu is the sustaining, and then Shiva is the end. So it represents beginning, middle, end, but then there's this cycle that keeps going on and on. Number 7, most Hindus choose a personal deity, a form of Brahman with whom they can feel a personal connection. So they do prayers, ceremonial worship, chanting of the deity's name, pilgrimage, all those sorts of things. So they give devotion to those gods. So that's their view of the absolute, mostly impersonal. And really what it gets down to is, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here because we're just getting into the concept of the world here. But if you're a Hindu, you're going to believe that Brahman is the only thing that's really real. And as a matter of fact, everything else is an illusion. So, even our sensory experience and all the things that we think are real are actually just illusions. So, according to Hinduism, as Brahman is the only thing that's real, you as a person also have a soul, which is called an Atman, which is somehow supposed to be connected with this absolute. And really the only thing that matters in life is somehow getting your soul to unify with this absolute. And the reason why you're not able to do that in this life is because you're caught into all the cravings and the lust and the desire of life. And the only way you're going to ever be able to merge with this ultimate entity or this absolute is if you, in a sense, lose your personhood and get away from the cravings and the desires of life. So, in a nutshell, that's why you see the yoga and the meditation and all this sort of thing within Hinduism, is because there's a sense in which people are trying to meditate themselves out of consciousness and personhood, which is, quite a thing to try to accomplish. If you look at the world, which would be on point B here, according to Hinduism, the universe is eternal, but it's constantly changing. Brahman and the universe are closely related, but there's some differences. According to Hinduism, point number 3, the universe moves in endlessly recurring cycles like the motion of a wheel. So it's going to be a very circular, cyclical understanding of things. If you look at point number 5, the universe is made of several different realms, but basically the universe consists of a triloka or triple world system. So they believe in an upper heavenly realm that is the abode of gods, goddesses, demons, and semi-divine beings. There's a lower realm of demons, and then there's a middle earthly realm where we are. And so within Hinduism, you will see discussion of things like demons and supernatural beings. That's not the same realm here of Brahman, but again, remember, if you believe in the cycle of reincarnation, in other words, this is probably your 10,000th life. They would say that, I'm just throwing that number out. But after a person dies, based on their karma, they may go to a realm, again, this is what the Hindus are saying, they may go to a realm where there's some sort of temporary blessing and rest, or if you've been really bad, you can go to a place where there's suffering. But eventually, no matter what realm you're in, you'll get kicked back into the cycle of lives. You may be as a higher caste if you did well, if you didn't assume karmic debt, or you may actually become an animal or a cricket or something like that because you didn't do as well. But you're kind of caught in this cycle of lives. So in between your present life, you may actually go to another realm and have some kind of blessing or punishment, but then you're kicked back into the system. As far as the human person in Hinduism, what you have here is our self consists of more than the mind and the body. Point number 2 is pretty significant here. At our core lies Atman, our unchanging universal self. So every person has a soul, and really the goal of your life is to get your soul to merge with this impersonal absolute. There's as I mentioned here on point number 3, there is a very close connection between a person's Atman and Brahman. In fact, some Hindus equate a person's Atman with Brahman. So the current life that a person is living is not his first. In fact, our current life is one link in a chain of lives that extends into the past and the future. So Now, the reason why I'm describing all this is because when we get to the solution and the biblical approach, we can point these contrasts out, to them to show them the truth. But again, we as Christians believe that, we have one life, and then after this comes judgment. For them, it just keeps going on and on and on. So this is not your first life and probably won't be your last. What's the human problem in Hinduism? As I told you before, every religion and philosophy admits that there's something wrong. I don't know of any religion yet that just flat out says, yeah, everything is how it's supposed to be. You don't need to worry about anything. So what's the problem according to Hinduism? The problem is that our Atman, or our soul, is supposed to be united with Brahman. But there's been this severance. And what is it? It's through cravings and lust and things such as greed, hatred, and ignorance that we lose sight of our Atman and get off track to unification with Brahman. So in other words, it's lust, desires, and all those sorts of things that get your focus off of unification with Brahman, and that's the problem. So, as point 3 mentions, humans must struggle with samsara, which is the wheel of birth and rebirth that keeps turning. And this is caused by lack of knowledge and unfulfilled desires. So, you're just caught in this. Like that, to a Westerner who hasn't probably thought about a lot, they may say, well, that's kind of, reincarnation might be cool. At least I know that I'm going to be something else in the next life. It's not cool according to a Hindu worldview because you're caught in this trap. So it's as a matter of fact, it's an illusional trap. It's not even a reality trap. You're just caught in this circle of death and suffering and all these sorts of things. Supposedly, the law that governs this reincarnation wheel is karma. So, according to Hindu karma, our present life is the consequences of the actions of our previous lives. Understanding this can lead to right choices, desires, and deeds. Karma is the framework for Hindu ethics. Karma is the moral law under which we function, just like our bodies are under the law of gravity. When we cause pain or injury, we add to the karmic debt we carry into our future lives. When selfless, we lighten our karmic debt load. So within Hinduism, it's a pure works thing. It is you get what you deserve. And so as you add karmic debt, that's a bad thing. So if you do things that aren't right, or if you harm things, it can even get to the point in more extreme forms of Hinduism, or I don't have Jainism up there anymore, which is an offshoot of Hinduism, that even like accidentally stepping on a bug can lead to karmic debt. So, imagine how frustrating that could be. It doesn't even matter if you intended to do it sometimes. Just the very fact of killing something can lead to karmic debt in your lives, and so it just keeps going on and on. The solution to the human problem, according to Hinduism, is to first of all gain awareness of your Atman and Atman's relationship with Brahman. This relationship needs to be pursued diligently. So, in other words, you need to become enlightened that Brahman is there and that you need to unify with Brahman. Discovery of the Atman's relationship with Brahman can lead to the pursuit of moksha, which is the liberation of the soul from the cycle of rebirths. Now, this is important to get, because when you come to talking to a Hindu, this is going to be something you want to talk about, is they want liberation. So again, to them, reincarnation is not a good thing. It just means that you're caught in the cycle. As a matter of fact, if you're a serious Hindu, the goal is to eventually be able to get out of this cycle of lives and to merge with Brahman. And again, some people have likened, Brahman being an ocean and you being a drop of water. You want to get to that point where you're dropped into that ocean so you can just merge. But again, it's a very personless, very impersonal concept. So they want to be liberated. In the pursuit of moksha, number 3, the person diligently undertakes a process that will lead to the unification of his Atman with Brahman. This involves the complete discarding of all cravings and desires. This process can take many lives to accomplish as the person is reincarnated. So, and that many lives, we're talking many here. This could be thousands of lives, and for some, you never even get there. So it can be a very hopeless endeavor. So really what you're trying to do is every life that you have, you're trying to live in such a way that you lighten your karmic debt and you can have a better status in the next life, which can get you in a position to unify with Brahman. Supposedly those who are Hindus in the highest caste, particularly the spiritual leaders, have the best opportunity to unify with Brahman. And if you do that, let's say that you're a Hindu spiritual leader and you're spending the last 20 years of your life meditating away from everybody else in the forest, the goal is that you can not have to be reincarnated again. So although reincarnation goes on and on and on, there does come a point where you supposedly can reach unification. Yeah.
Not that they ask these kinds of questions, but given that they think we've been at this now for a long time, doesn't it occur to them that if we've all been doing this all these times, how come we're not all getting better? Did they believe that Brahman continues to divide, or whatever it is that produces new people? Are there actually new people with new Atmans showing up on the scene somewhere out there, or have we all been because you think eventually it would get better. I mean, everything would get better.
Yeah. There's no creation point, so there really is no. What's interesting within Hinduism, even the universe goes in cycles. So I mean, there can even be millions and billions of years, and then for even the universe.
Get better, but then it all falls apart.
Yeah. There are some forms of Hinduism and offshoots of that with Jainism will actually see that the cycle sometimes gets so bad that the religion will be lost, and then in another universe era it'll be picked up again. I guess in a nutshell what this is going to come down to is, of course it's all the Spirit of God working in a person's life. The thing that you should get from this religion is that it's very hopeless and despairing and depressing and goes so contrary to how God made the universe and who God is. And it does appear to be, when God's working in the heart of a Hindu, that oftentimes the thing that they're so grateful for with Christ and Christianity is the hope and the relationship, which is totally devoid in this religion. Yep, Travis.
Do they think that like bugs and stuff experience karma? Like,
oh yeah.
How does a bug get?
As a matter of fact, Travis, if you mess up, you may be a bug in the next life. They just do? I mean, that's a great question to ask as far as just the whole issue of whether bugs can be self-conscious or whatever, but they're still in the system. It's still, you can do things. As a matter of fact, the Buddha, you got to remember now, Buddhism stems from Hinduism. And when the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was looking for enlightenment, when he supposedly received enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he actually saw all of his past lives, including when he was an insect and an animal, and all the things that he did that either pushed him back or pushed him forward. And so it all counts, it all matters. Yep, Jared.
I don't know if this is true, I don't know if I can articulate the question well, but I heard that there's something bound up in karma where you don't want to do, like, give to the poor, or you don't want to do things.
Mess with somebody else's karma. Yeah. So there's a sense in which even like in some instances, charity and graciousness, in a sense, can almost mess with. There's a sense in which when you do things, you can almost mess with the given status of somebody else, or at least that's what some think. So yeah. So and really, when you look at anybody, there's a sense within Hinduism. And again, you get different people with different variation. They don't all think the same thing. It's all, a lot of times it's person variable, but in general, if you see somebody in a bad condition, there's a sense in which you can say, well, that person just got what they deserved. And so there are people that point out that it definitely can harm, the biblical concept of graciousness and compassion and all that sort of thing. Yep. Travis?
Like for the people, like science and stuff has affected Christianity a lot, where people sort of hold to Christianity but still sort of hold to a secular view. Like, how's that affected Hinduism? Is there sort of a general sense of karma, but maybe they don't believe all the specific points?
So in other words, how has like naturalism affected Hinduism?
Yeah, or just like the modern era with science.
Yeah, I would say that Hindus see, again, it's very eclectic. As a matter of fact, there's a sense in which Hinduism can absorb, they think they can absorb Christianity and just call Christ another avatar, or somebody like Krishna. In general, Hindus will say we don't see any contradiction with science, because as a matter of fact, the whole concept of evolution and all that stuff can just go along with their concept of of an eternal universe. So they don't the traditional historian, philosophical understanding of the religions will say, Hindus don't have as much problem with evolution as Christians do. It absorbs it much easier because of their long length of the eternality of the universe. Yeah, let's go here, Jan, and we'll go to John there.
If there's a cycle of life that where's the Atman, the people comes right now to existence. I mean, there's more people, obviously, today than thousands of years ago.
To me, when you get to the whole issue of the origins and the starting point and all that, I think there ends up being a problem, an inherent problem. But there's not so much creation going on all the time as just that there's, everything that is. And so, but I would admit that that's a problem. Yeah.
Following up on the idea of, not giving to the poor if their, if their karma has put them there.
Yeah.
Would Hindus have some idea of grace and mercy, but just maybe tempered by karma? Is that just completely out of their system?
I would say they do, but when they do, they're being inconsistent.
Okay.
Yeah, because technically it is a very non-grace religion, very much so. So, and of course, do Hindus sometimes show grace and all kinds of stuff? I would say yes, but when they do, they're being inconsistent with their worldview. Yeah, Dan, and then we'll go over here.
I was actually talking to a Hindu on that very issue. And he was somewhat inconsistent, but the main reason that you would do something like this individual was a doctor, that you would actually help somebody is more about your karma than about helping the individual. So it's a very selfish.
Yeah, so it ends up being selfish-oriented. Yeah, and a lot of times the staying on the good side of the karma isn't so much with acts of compassion, all that sort of thing, but just staying within your role within a caste. So there's a sense in which stepping out of your caste to help lower caste could actually be harmful. So it's not with the same motives and all that. Yes?
Just trying to understand their goal. So moksha was like a liberation.
Moksha is liberation.
And that's actually distinguished from unification with Brahma.
They're closely related. Moksha ends up being, you become united with Brahman through moksha. So I guess we can make a distinction, but they're interrelated. So you wouldn't be unified with Brahman if you didn't have moksha. Because moksha ends up being the break from the cycle of lives. You won't be reincarnated, and thus you'll be with Brahman. So they're very close.
It kind of sounds like you still have, after achieving moksha, you still have to do certain acts or still work towards that unification. Right?
No, I mean, they're close. It's such a close, if you reach moksha, you've unified. The pursuit is over. Yeah.
So moksha is basically you turn into a impersonal being, basically.
Right. The best analogy I give you is you're the drop of water in an ocean. Yeah. That's what it becomes, right? And so again, like I said, with all the yogas and the meditation, because there's different stages within Hinduism. When you get to the very last stage, which is the most serious stage, where literally it calls for literally going out into the wilderness and separating from everybody. There comes a point where you're spending your remaining days around nobody, trying to meditate yourself into nothingness. Yeah, Tim.
Did you already mention how who decides what is good and what is bad, and how you move up? Who figures that out?
Yeah. In other words, the karma ends up being but to me, there's a huge problem with the whole concept of karma, because what there still ends up being some, this is what's right and this is what's not right, and there's no basis for that with an impersonal. So to me, the whole concept of karma is inconsistent. To me, what it ends up being is, I think the religious teachers that end up really codifying these sorts of things around 1500 are the ones that end up determining what it is. But I guess maybe to use Bonson language, I think it's at that point where they start making distinctions where they borrow somewhat from the Christian worldview, because that's a huge problem. How can you have any kind of standard of anything with an impersonal? Yep. And
you know how they respond to suffering if they believe karma? And I've always wanted to hear how they would say, because essentially what they're saying is a person get what they deserve, whether in the past life or current life. So if they suffer, how do they respond? Do they just say, this is what I deserve? An idea?
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have a problem with suffering?
As a matter of fact, compared to what we would view with the Christian worldview, yes, it is to a much lesser degree, yeah. As a matter of fact, I mean, like one example would be, is even one example that I've heard from people who've discussed this issue is like even like if a woman loses her child, let's say that there's a death of a 1-year-old or something, there's a sense in which there's an understanding of that's, well, this is deserved, this is what's supposed to be, and plus there's another life that's coming, and so some people have pointed out that it's actually had an impact on, you know, issues of compassion and that sort of thing. So yeah, in general, there's the understanding that it's deserved. Like I said, there's really no concept of grace. And now when you get into Buddhism, there'll actually be offshoots of Buddhism that see some forms of grace, but even then it's kind of weak. But it is a get what you deserve religion. Okay, let's do Matt, and then we'll take a break.
If karma is an impersonal standard, and is there any desire to kind of circumvent or get around or go over karma or escape it? And
no.
If you did, that'd be good.
Because it's likened to a law. I mean, like, you know, law of gravity or something like that. As a matter of fact, some people, you know, we were talking about the whole issue of karma, and it's, I mean, some people even emphasize it's not so much a moral standard as it is just a law of the universe. And so it's not something that can be bypassed or tinkered with or anything like that. We're talking about how Hindus believe they can approach the issue of the problem. I mentioned on number 4 that there's the concept of yoga is, you know, in its purest Hindu form is a technique that achieves a union with Brahman. So there's different types of yogas for different sorts of personalities or whatever, but supposedly it's a technique to try to help you to merge with the Absolute. Number 5, the pursuit of the moksha involves the lightening of karmic debt, and there are things a person can do to lighten and be free of karmic debt. You could do selfless actions or yogas or purifications or devotions. It should be understood, point number 6, top of page 108, that although moksha should be the ultimate aim of every Hindu, Hinduism does allow for the pursuit of other aims in the present life. So, again, remember, this is a long process if you're a Hindu, and Hinduism doesn't require that every person be going, pedal to the metal, all out. And so, in other words, you can devote your present life to a life of pleasure or the pursuit of wealth and power, but eventually, moksha needs to be the main thing that you're concerned about, which would be pursuit of liberation from the chain of lives. So, generally, I think within Hinduism, reaching moksha, at least according traditionally to Hinduism, is not something that women could accomplish. So women need to be reincarnated as men in order to reach moksha. And if you're of a lower caste or a non-Hindu or whatever, you have no shot. So generally it's for those of the highest caste, the highest social grouping, and then even the most dedicated of those, and then even then it's not guaranteed. When Buddhism comes along, Buddhism is going to say, it's going to accept karma, it's going to accept the cycle of lives, but it's going to say, you can reach liberation or moksha being a woman, and Buddhists throw away the whole caste system and the social structure thing. So Buddhism will end up having a fair amount of missionary success with the lower caste of Hinduism. As far as, the community and ethics, I think because of the fact that people are made in the image of God, there ends up being a basic morality system that's true even within Hinduism. But you do have that caste system. You see the major groupings there at the bottom of page 108. You have the priests, the teachers, the scholars. That's the highest level. Then you have the kings, the warriors, the government officials. Then farmers, traders, merchants, and then the unskilled workers, and then the untouchables, which are by far the lowest, who get the worst jobs. Important to Hindu community is the stages of life. An individual's life is divided into 4 successive stages. So when you're a young person, you'll be trained in the principles and in the life of a Hindu. Then there's also a householder stage, which is marriage and family. So, one question could be well, if you're seeking moksha, why even worry about a family? Just go, off into the wilderness or whatever. So there is an allowance, for that stage for marriage, for family. But as you get older in life, You get to the retirement stage and the Yasin stage, where as your family moves out, you start to focus more on, I guess in a sense, a better placement in the pursuit of moksha, or again, better stated for reincarnation in the next life. So when you get to that fourth stage, that can literally, once you get where your family's out of the house or whatever, that's where you really should take an ascetic approach to life and get away from everybody and just, go into the forest or whatever and just do meditations and yogas and that sort of thing to try to merge with the absolute. Yeah.
How do they see raising children? How do they perceive that as far
as a very noble thing within stage 2? So in other words,
I guess I'm thinking of the actual training. Do they believe that they have karma all the way from the moment they're born, and that
they would be reincarnated. Yes. Yeah, so they would be. It's not like they'd be necessarily receiving an atman at that time, but it would be as part of the process. So in other words, when you're having a child, that's not that child's first life.
But when they deal with children, do they feel like they're messing with their karma or whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, through the ins and outs of raising children? I mean, do they just let them go, do whatever they want?
No, there ends up being. That's a good question, because there ends up being a sense in which they obviously view training as important, because if you read, their literature talks about strict rules of discipline and how they're to, because they end up having, an instructor and a guru and all that sort of stuff. So there's very specific instructions about how to act and rules and all that kind of stuff. So it does end up coming into play somehow. Okay, so I have some other things about they're, why don't Hindus, from the Western perspective, they say, well, there's people starving in India, why don't they eat the cows that are walking in the street? The cow is a symbol of the value of all living things. It's held to be sacred because it was dear to Krishna. Many Hindus do not eat beef. Many are vegetarians, so they avoid some of those foods. Page 110, the interpretation of history in Hinduism. The Hindu view of history is cyclical or circular. The universe operates according to cycles. According to Robinson and Rodriguez, Hindus believe that the universe undergoes cyclical processes of creation, preservation, and destruction. Thus, the current manifestation of the cosmos is just one of innumerable universes that have preceded it and that will succeed it. Since antiquity, the Hindus have had a sense of the vastness of cosmic time, and thus each manifestation of the universe is measured in periods of immense duration. It is believed that we currently live in the Kali Yuga, the most degenerate period, within a group of 4 yugas known as the Maha Yuga. The quality of life and human virtue progressively declined throughout the Maha Yuga, which was at 4,320,000 years. The Kali Yuga lasts for 432,000 years and only recently began its onset marked by the Great War of the Mahabharata in about 3000 BC. So the universe is cyclical. As far as life after death, Hinduism believes in reincarnation. All living things experience the cycle of rebirths until ultimate union with Brahman, which is moksha. Since moksha is very difficult with only a few attaining it, most people experience reincarnation thousands of times before even being close to experiencing moksha. The way one acts in this life determines what his or her lot will be in the next. One's status in the next life is determined by karma. One can be born a lowly worm, a horse, a lion, etc. One can also be born as a human. Moksha is not available for women, so it is considered better to be born a man. The best position to be born into that is of a man of a high caste, state, or a guru. These are the ones most likely to achieve moksha. Number 4, there is no way to describe ultimate union with Brahman. It is a merging of oneself into the cosmic divine. One illustration is that union with Brahman is like the merging of a drop of water with the ocean. One loses all identity as he becomes part of Brahman. As far as other religions, it's probably best to identify Hinduism with inclusivism. It does not claim that it is the only way, although it certainly holds that it is the best way. Hindus are usually glad when others learn and incorporate principles of Hinduism. It's also very eclectic in that it is open to incorporating elements of other religions and philosophies. In regard to Christianity, Hindus often have no problem with adding Jesus to their list of avatars which are human manifestations of the divine. They are very resistant, though, to the concept of totally rejecting Hinduism for Christianity. So, there's accounts of Christians who've gone over and, everybody has different experiences, but have been mildly surprised at perhaps that there's somewhat of a receptive audience when you're talking about Christianity. But when there starts being talk of exclusivism, then it can get much more heated. Hinduism generally lives in harmony with the other religions of India, such as Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, which are spin-offs of Hinduism. Hindus have often had conflicts with Muslims overall, though Hinduism is not regarded as a militaristic or evangelistic religion. Then there's very rich, there's rituals. The red dot that we often see on the forehead of the women, that's called the bindi dot, or the little drop. It's a location over an energy point. It's supposed to help with meditation. Travis?
How would they see violence against other religions? Is that really bad, or would that be something that would be acceptable in certain situations?
Yeah, I think you've seen different. I think there's been different. Officially, it's supposed to be known as peaceful. The way it's worked out, I think you'd get different approaches. I think the more traditional forms might see that there can be in a sense, a righteous use of. Because from what I understand, there's been some pretty, they may be inclusive on a general scale, but there's been some strong opposition too. Brad, you saw some of that when you were over there, didn't you? As far as some of their strong approach towards.
Oh yeah.
So. You had to deal with that over there, didn't you? As far as, there was the threat of violence with you guys there and all that you saw.
Yeah,
Did they talk about any of that, or?
Yeah, they do. It's talked about by Christians because they're the most common targets.
Yeah.
But outside of that, it's not really discussed.
Yeah.
But the thing that I noticed was where you were just talking about, they're glad to incorporate any other faith into Hinduism, but not to reject Hinduism for Christianity.
For Christianity, right.
And that's very common. A problem they're having in India is the Christians are finding out that people want to claim to be Christians, but not give up their Hindu customs.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They want to wear the dot.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that is because they see it as cultural, they say, but in reality, when you talk to them, it's
also
more
religious.
We love Jesus too, like you do, but we love
Mm-hmm.
our Hindu gods as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think you might get different answers to that. One thing too within Hindu, I haven't really pointed this out, but we're very book centered in the sense of our commitment to the Scripture. They have their own scriptures, but it's very vast and even admittedly contradictory at points. So if you point out a contradiction within Hinduism, they don't necessarily see that as a problem. And so I think you might get some different approaches on that. Again, I mentioned their scriptures here. I'm not going to get into that. I want to, let's jump over to page 116. Let's talk about Christianity confronts Hinduism. Let's just talk about maybe some helpful tips. Christian outreach to Hindus, page 116, goes back to early times of the church. According to an ancient tradition, the Apostle Thomas was the first to carry the gospel to India. There was also some sporadic efforts to establish a church in India prior to the classical missions. Of course, when you get to number 2, Christianity and Hinduism confronted each other during the British rule in India. The activities of the Christian missionaries and the politics of the East India Company led to the Mutiny of 1857. According to Paul Reed and Dr. Winfried Corduan, Hindu Indians have responded to the gospel more readily than their Muslim counterparts. It is estimated that about 3% of the population of India is Christian today. As far as reaching Hindus, as I've look at some of the principles that we've talked about in class, and just as you read over testimonies of Hindus who've come to Christ and people who've shared with them, there's some things we can point out. I think we have to keep in mind the basics, then we'll talk about some strategies. Point A, because of our Lord's command to take the gospel to all people, and because of our love for all people who are spiritually lost, Christians must have a desire to share the gospel with Hindus. While generally promoting high ethical standards, Hinduism is a false religion and its people are in spiritual darkness. While the worldview of Hindus is usually quite different from that of Christians, they are still made in the image of God, and this means the following. The image of God within Hindus is a point of contact for the Christian trying to reach Hindus. Based on Romans 1, all people, including Hindus, have an innate knowledge of God because of the testimony of God's general revelation in nature. This understanding of God has been suppressed, but it is real nonetheless. So there is a real sense in which Hindus know in their hearts that they are creatures who are accountable to the Creator. And the only way a Hindu will respond to the gospel is if God opens his or her heart. The God-ordained means for reaching all people, including Hindus, is faithful gospel proclamation, a presentation that is relying on God's Spirit, supported by prayer, based on Scripture, and is done with humility and concern. As far as strategies go, you do want to show genuine love and concern for the Hindu you have contact with. A genuine testimony in both word and deed can be powerful. Number two, or the next point here, point B is important. Engage the person, not just the religion of Hinduism. So, I mean, that's going to be true, I think, for anybody that you witness to. I mean, usually they're associated with some group. And of course, if you understand their religion as their backdrop, that's going to help you to be even more strategic as you address false thinking and idolatrous thinking. But again, you have to be a little bit flexible in the sense that sometimes people are a little bit eclectic at points, or perhaps even maybe a little inconsistent with them. So again, remember, as you're sharing with people, you're sharing with people. It's not just an encounter with Hinduism, it's an encounter with the person who's trapped within Hinduism. So you want to deal with them as a person. You want to ask questions about his or her beliefs on various worldview issues. So again, I think as we've talked about before, find out, as you deal with people, to get them talking on the most important issues. So ask them about their beliefs. They also say, too, that you should ask for clarification on terminology, because when you're dealing with people of different religions, they may throw out terms like salvation or God. You can't ever assume that they mean the same thing by that. So you always have to be clear. Now, what do you mean by that? And be specific, be precise. Also remember, number 3, that Hinduism is a vast and eclectic religion, so the individual Hindu you are speaking to may have his or her own views that differ at times from others. I'll say once you have listened, offer the biblical perspective on the worldview issues that have been brought up. Help them to be aware of what the Bible says on these issues. Look for opportunities to talk to the Hindu about God's grace, peace, and forgiveness of sins. I think this point's important here. Hinduism is a very works-oriented religion in which you get exactly what you deserve. Many Hindus have said that these topics appeal to them since there is no mercy and forgiveness within Hinduism. As a matter of fact, Matthew 11:28 has been particularly effective. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. So when you're talking with people from Eastern religions, of course you have to do it in the context of sin and the lordship of Christ and all that. But but the concepts of grace, peace, forgiveness are really foreign to them. Next thing you really would want to talk about too is the relational aspect of Christianity. The image of God within us makes us relational creatures. Hinduism goes against human nature, and I would even just say the image of God, by stressing the loss of personhood in the pursuit of the impersonal Brahman. State that a personal God wants a relationship with him, fellowship with him. Also stress that God's personal nature means that sin is an offense to God, and that those who die apart from God will be separated from him for eternity. So the relationship thing is big. Next, expect that the deity of Jesus and the exclusive nature of Christianity may be obstacles for the Hindu. Do not run from these truths, but back them up with Scripture and Jesus' claims about himself. According to Reed and Corduan, the key to a Christian witness to Hindus, as is true in various ways for all groups, is to engage the person, not the religion of the person. Because Hinduism in general does not stress humanitarian efforts, outreach projects centered on works of mercy, such as educational facilities, hospitals, or leprosaria, have had great success. In the face of perplexity engendered by the diversity of Hindu beliefs, the assurance of truth and salvation experienced by Christians has spoken to many Hindus. Loving relationships that do not recognize the boundaries of caste or social station have led a number of Hindus to find Christ. And finally, sensitive Christian outreach to Hindus has demonstrated that Jesus Christ can free people from the domination of demons and bondage that often is an integral part of Hinduism outside of textbooks. So that's another thing that's true. From testimonies of Hindus too is, and we haven't talked a whole lot about it, but because there are those other realms of existence with the, with the other beings, the gods and the demons and that sort of thing, there oftentimes is a great bondage to fear. And you'll see that, particularly with some of the other religions, oftentimes religions of Africa, etc. But they oftentimes do live in great fear of those sorts of things. So I did think it was interesting that these individuals pointed out that I'm back on page 118, that Hinduism in general does not stress humanitarian efforts. And so oftentimes they will respond to certain acts of kindness. As far as confronting the worldview of Hinduism, the absolute in the universe, we would point out, is not the impersonal Brahman. The absolute is the God of the Bible, a personal God who created the universe for his purposes and glory. The God of the Bible is also a revealing God who has made himself known in his creation and also his written word, the Bible. So I would say, when we read Bahnsen and Frame and all that, there was a heavy emphasis on atheism. And I think there's a sense in which there's a fair amount of similarity on how you could address this issue transcendentally. With atheism, they end up saying there is no absolute. But then they're very hard pressed to try to explain why there's any kind of right and wrong or any kind of morality or how you explain evil. I think you could handle it somewhat similarly with Hinduism in the sense, although they won't say there is no absolute, their absolute is impersonal. And again, you still run into that problem of how you get any kind of degrees of goodness or morality or any explanation for why there's evil in the world from an impersonal absolute. So I think on that point of the absolute, if you were to go that route, there'd be a fair amount of similarity between how you might deal with an atheist and a person of an Eastern religion. As far as the world goes, remember, Hinduism is telling you that the world or the universe is an illusion. But the world or the universe is not an illusion, as Hinduism asserts. It is a real entity created directly by the supernatural activity of God. The world was created good, but now has been tainted with a curse because of man's sin. The universe will one day be restored after the second coming of Jesus Christ. So I think there's a sense in which they know in their heart that that's not true. I think God has created us with the faculties to, well, things can be misperceived or whatever. In general, our faculties reveal to us reality on the sensory level and otherwise. And so Hinduism's telling you that it's not real, but that doesn't end up being livable. Number 3, humans are not the product of the near endless cycle of reincarnation. They are beings created in the image of God. They have one life to live that prepares them either for eternal happiness in the presence of God or eternal punishment away from the presence of God. For it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this comes judgment. Humans were created for a relationship and thus find the greatest fulfillment in life when they are in a proper relationship with their Creator and with other people who know God. As far as problem for humans, the problem for humans is not the cycle of rebirth or ignorance. It is alienation from the God who created them. The problem for humans is moral. Humans have sinned, and in doing so have separated themselves from their Creator, who demands and expects their worship and allegiance. As far as the solution goes, the solution for humans is not moksha or escape from the cycle of rebirths. The solution is the incarnation of Jesus, God's Son, who came to earth to pay the penalty for sins. Those who believe in Jesus can find forgiveness and can be restored to fellowship with God, and our hope hinges on Him. As far as community and ethics, while Hinduism certainly allows for family and community, its pursuit of Brahman downplays the community aspect that God has made so important. The more one pursues Brahman, the more one separates himself from the Hindu community. Christianity, though, stresses intimate communion with the people of God. The more one knows God, the more one should love others. Christianity calls its members to love others and minister to them. Plus, the Christian community is the church, which is made of people who have experienced the saving and forgiving love of God. As a human being, you do not have to face the problems of life alone. The Christian community can come alongside to help you and exhort you. Also, ethics is not based on the impersonal cosmic law of karma. It is based on the character of the God of the Bible, who has revealed his standards in the hearts of men in written scriptures. Ethics is a personal matter, since ultimately all good and bad deeds and thoughts are directed to the Creator. So again, I think I think you can go after the whole issue of the impersonal absolute and the whole issue of karma, because there ends up being distinctions made between right and wrong and good and bad and those sorts of things. But again, I guess you could press them. How do you get any kind of standard, if you're not dealing with some kind of personal backdrop? Yep.
I'm a little confused when we say that it lends itself to high ethical standards, but very little humanitarian efforts. Mm-hmm. Where is that ethics channel? If they have high ethical standards, but they're not really into humanitarian effort, what are they?
Yeah, I guess by saying that, it may be high, might be overstating things, but I'm just saying there ends up being general. The way that it ends up working out, even though I would say it's inconsistent, is there still ends up being basic understandings of faithfulness, loyalty, not stealing, those sorts of things. Now, I guess when it comes relatively to like Christianity, oftentimes with humanitarian efforts, it definitely falls short of that. So maybe maybe overstating it a little bit. So I guess that statement was a way of saying that there ends up being a basic standard of morality that they apply to, although as a whole, it's not as much as you would see like with Christianity.
Like a personal discipline type of versus...
Yeah, and the motivation. Like I said, with Christianity, there's more of doing it to actually for the sake of helping others and doing it for the glory of God, whereas opposed it's more of a selfish means to an end. But again, there ends up being Hindus who do it inconsistently. I think there ends up being relatively acts of compassion and that kind of thing, but in doing so, I think it ends up being inconsistent. Is there a hand over here?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that being said, though, too, with the caste system
Mm-hmm.
and even the view of women, I was talking to Sandy Samuels, and he was saying, even up to a couple of years ago, there's people who have wives bumped off, and it's seen as normal, not a big deal.
Right. One thing that has been tradition is the whole issue of when a man dies, that the wife is burned as he's burned. What do you call it again for the cremation? That they'll have the woman thrown on the cremation pyre. Supposedly, as things get more modern and the West is influencing things more, supposedly you're starting to see less and less of that in the more metropolis areas. But in the rural areas, and if you look at the history of it, that's been quite common. And because the caste system is so strong, being in a higher caste and showing acts of compassion to the untouchables is actually viewed as a bad thing. So it's very relative when it comes to the acts of goodness within the system. Okay, interpretation of history. History is not cyclical in the Hindu sense. The universe and humans do not operate in endless cycles. God created the world at a point in time, and there is a coming time when the present era will end and new heavens and earth will be established. This makes the actions and decisions of people important, since what they do in this life affects their eternal destiny. Life after death, you'd want to say there is no reincarnation, no second chances in the next life. A person will either enjoy the presence of God in heaven and eventually the new heavens and new earth, or suffer the penalty of eternal separation from God in the lake of fire. Relationship to other religions. Christianity rightly stresses that Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. Hinduism does not offer saving truth. So you might find relative truth based on being made in the image of God with the law written on people's hearts. But again, that's not saving truth. Ultimate truth is found with Christianity. And then, of course, with rituals and symbols, you can use the symbols of Christianity to explain spiritual truths. Okay, so those are some thoughts on Hinduism there. Any comments or questions on any of that? So you'll find it to be pretty similar. Like I said, we're going to, when we talk about Hinduism, you'll see kind of that basic structure. Now, Buddhism is going to be relatively even more impersonal, because Buddhism actually kind of borders on atheism a little bit. So there's a sense in which Brahman, Siddhartha Gautama was the first Buddha, just pretty much was just, I guess, agnostic when it came to the whole concept of a supreme being. You'll still have gods and realms of existence with ghosts and demons and that kind of stuff, but it borders on atheism. But we'll be talking about that later. Any other thoughts on Hinduism? Yep.
Well, what's the name of that practice when the husband dies and the wife is
with the cremation? The name of the, I can't remember. Was it? Is it? Yeah, I can't remember the exact title. Yeah, that'd be easy to look up probably on the internet after class. I can't remember the title. Yeah.
Yoga is like the merger with the impersonal. It would seem to be contrary, obviously, to Christianity, yet so many churches actually have a cousin who practices it. She's Christian.
Practices what, Hinduism?
No, yoga.
Yoga, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, like, is that something that we should
That's a good question.
be made more aware of,
Yeah.
in terms of the churches with like a yoga ministry?
Yeah. That's a good question. I've even looked that up on the, there's a lot of people who have their opinion on that as far as Christians and yoga. You just Google that and you'll get a bunch of different opinions on that. I'm uncomfortable with it. I don't know if it's such where, because you do have a lot of, it appears to be, Christian groups or whatever kind of incorporate some of that as part of an exercise program and all that, but I don't know if I could, when it comes down to things like that, it ties into other issues as far as how much do you associate the real meaning with this practice. Then we could talk about Christmas trees and Easter eggs and all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of it ends up coming down as, how do we and what's the connotations that you're giving for participation and all that kind of thing. So I don't know if I could condemn it. I'm personally not comfortable with it. I remember doing an exercise program pretty lately that had a lot of stuff with weights and pull-ups and all this kind of stuff, but then they had one devoted to yoga. I just always skipped it. So I don't know, you guys have any thoughts on that? I'm not comfortable with it personally. I don't know if I could just flat out just say it's wrong in every case or whatever, but I don't like it. Go ahead, Jeff.
A lady at our church back home, we taught Christian yoga at a community yoga center. And instead of emptying your minds, she would tell the people to think about Jesus Christ as the creator, the Son of God, and then she got fired, of course.
Oh, I have to bring that up, yeah. Yeah, could see why. You do have to take into account, yoga, and even with the Americanized versions of it, to me, it seems to me that there ends up being some attempt to try to, they talk about clearing your mind and forgetting everything and forgetting, I don't know, I'm just uncomfortable with that. Like I said, I'm not enough to condemn it or whatever, but I just don't like any ideas of trying to not or to forget yourself or not think of anything. That just doesn't seem right or good. John, were you going to say something?
I was just wondering if it would fall under more Romans 14 type of, if you want to do it for personal exercise, without all the religious connotation, okay, but because of the religious connotation, and it could be a cause of stumbling for somebody, you don't bring it into the church.
Certainly, yeah. I think, as far as a liberty issue, sure. I think those principles would apply, definitely. And I think it could be a point of stumbling block for some people. I'd never be comfortable with it where people try to get to the point where you try to lose yourself or lose your consciousness or whatever. I'd never be comfortable with that. But I think that's a good way to put it.